Hello, welcome to TelecomTV. My name is Tony Chan, and with me today is Chris Wright from Red Hat. One of the biggest changes coming up in the telecoms industry is 5G because it promises to not only touch every application, but it also touches every part of the network, including the core network. And a lot of people say that virtualization has to play a role in that environment. From your perspective, how does OPNFV, Red Hat, and the whole open source community in general, how can they contribute or play a role in the 5G world, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think a big part of that is 5G is focused on how devices interoperate or interact with the edge of the network. So the access point is changing. It's changing in terms of latency, in terms of bandwidth, in terms of the number of simultaneous users or connections that we can support from a single access point. There's a set of opportunities there in terms of we're creating new infrastructure. We want to consolidate to use common platforms, and within that consolidation and creating a common platform, we now have the opportunity to add applications into this edge space and really create rich interactions between the data that's flowing through the network. More and more of that data is not just video data that people are streaming and downloading, but could also be video data that's being uploaded. Think of a set of sensors in an autonomous vehicle taking in a lot of context as you're driving. And while not all of that is being fed into the network and making decisions for how the car behaves, big portions of that data is potentially uploaded and used for training and anomalous type of detection. So other types of sensors, got a lot of rich data sources pulling data into the network. So now we have an opportunity to look at what types of infrastructure sit at the edge, and we've already been building that infrastructure in the core, and to me that is the NFV platform. It's all of the underlying infrastructure that we're building today to transform today's networks. So I think of it as the kind of open source movement, the network function virtualization movement are critical prerequisites to making 5G successful.
Do you think the open source community is doing enough to actually assert itself within the standardization that's going on with 5G?
Standardization and open source has some interesting interplay. So one portion of the 5G standardization is really about the radio itself, and so I don't see the same level of opportunity there for where we interact with open source communities. Standards bodies also have their own ways of operating, which in some cases can actually be exclusive to open source communities because you have to sign documentation and kind of legal agreements that an open source community can't really sign. There's no legal entity that can sign these documents. So in certain areas it's going to be difficult. In other areas we are creating some level of de facto standardization through creating platforms and using open source as a collaborative mechanism to build those platforms and to work with standards bodies to say, here's the interfaces that we provide. Where can we create some standardization around those interfaces that map to your architectural diagrams in your standards group? So there's some definite synergy there, but there's also some areas where it's actually difficult to work together.
Okay. Since we're in Beijing, can you talk a little bit about open source community or the open source movement within China, and whether or not you see any cultural differences between, where Red Hat is based, which is North America and I think Eastern Europe, but and this part of the world, I guess?
Well, China is there's a huge developer population here in China. There's a great appetite for open source collaborative development and being part of these communities. There are some barriers. There's language barriers, there's time zone barriers, and there's cultural barriers. You see very common cultural behaviors in open source communities are about flattened hierarchies and meritocracy, and in an environment that's maybe more used to a hierarchical kind of structure, there's not an obvious mapping where you really need to find the key champions, people who are interested in getting involved in the communities and can help create some of that cultural translation. And I've seen great success in doing outreach, so bringing people from the community into China, working with developers directly, helping them understand some of the processes and helping them understand that it's important to express your voice and really participate and be, act as if you are a key member of a community in terms of being directly involved rather than just sort of an observer and a consumer. And so I think we'll see changes over the next few years as we really continue to push these collaborative efforts. And a perfect example of that is initially the OpenO project, which is focused on management and orchestration for NFV platforms. It's essentially launched by Chinese developers. It's a combination of China Mobile and Huawei and some other service providers and vendors in collaboration with a global community. But today that project has morphed into something called ONAP, and we still see a great interaction between Chinese development community and the rest of the orchestration development community. And I just think it's a perfect example of tip of the iceberg. So I'm enthusiastic, and I really find a lot of value in coming here and working with developers directly.
Great. Thank you very much.